Brian.
I always felt very sorry for Brian. He was two things. He was not very nice, and he upset people very easily. He wasn't very pleasant, I mean.
On the night of July 3rd, 1969, the world of rock music was jolted by the news that Brian Jones, the gifted and enigmatic founder of the Rolling Stones, had been found lifeless at the bottom of his swimming pool at Cotchford Farm in Sussex. Jones was only 27 years old, placing him among the first tragic figures to enter the infamous 27 Club. At the time, the official cause of death was listed as death by misadventure, suggesting accidental drowning under the influence of alcohol and drugs. Yet from the moment the news broke, whispers of foul play began to ripple through the music scene and among those who knew him personally. For decades, conflicting accounts, unexplored leads, and peculiar details about that evening would feed a cloud of mystery. Now, with new evidence surfacing and long-buried testimonies coming to light, the circumstances of Brian Jones's death are being seen through a starkly different lens, one that is as chilling as it is shocking. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Brian Jones was not just another rock star whose fame burned brightly before being extinguished too soon. He was the visionary who assembled the Rolling Stones, recruiting Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the others, shaping the band's early image and sound. His musicianship was extraordinary, with the ability to pick up nearly any instrument and make it sing. Yet behind his brilliance lay a man beset by emotional turbulence, drug use, and increasing alienation from his bandmates. By mid-1969, Jones had been edged out of the Rolling Stones altogether, his relationship with Jagger and Richards fracturing beyond repair. Publicly, it was framed as a necessary change due to his erratic behavior and inability to travel for concerts. Privately, it left Jones feeling abandoned, betrayed, and perhaps most dangerously, surrounded by people whose loyalties were questionable. Cotchford Farm, his countryside retreat once owned by A.A. Milne, author of Winnie the Pooh, had become Jones's refuge in the weeks after his split from the band. It was there that he spent his final days, often hosting small gatherings with friends, acquaintances, and workers who had been helping with renovations on the property. One such figure was Frank Thorogood, a builder who had been working on the house and grounds. Thorogood was not just a casual contractor, he had become a regular presence around Jones, sometimes joining in the socializing, sometimes appearing more like an uninvited fixture. On the night of July 2nd, leading into the early hours of July 3rd, Thorogood was among a handful of people at Cotchford. What happened between those evening hours and the moment Jones's lifeless body was spotted in the pool has remained one of rock history's most debated mysteries. The official account painted a vague and almost conveniently simple picture. Jones had been drinking, perhaps taking pills, and decided to go for a late-night swim. Something went wrong. Exhaustion, intoxication, perhaps a cramp, and he slipped under the water. But the holes in this narrative became evident as soon as witnesses began telling their versions of events. Some claimed Jones was not particularly intoxicated that night. Others reported raised voices, tension between Jones and Thorogood earlier in the evening, and strange behavior from certain guests after Jones was pulled from the water. Over the years, journalists, biographers, and even former police officers would revisit the case, each time uncovering scraps of information that hinted at violence or confrontation. The most damning threads involved suggestions that Jones and Thorogood had argued over money. Thorogood was allegedly owed payment for his building work, while Jones reportedly believed he was being overcharged or cheated. Their disputes had reportedly grown heated, and according to some, Thorogood's temper could be volatile. In the newly surfaced evidence, accounts from people close to the situation detail a physical altercation near the pool that night, one that escalated far beyond a shouting match. The emerging picture is not of a drunken accident, but of a struggle in the water, with Thorogood allegedly holding Jones down. If these testimonies are to be believed, the drowning was deliberate, not accidental. The shocking part of this revelation is not merely that Jones's death might have been a murder, but that there are now claims suggesting some people in authority knew or strongly suspected it at the time. Former detectives have come forward stating that the investigation was abruptly curtailed. Key statements were left out of the official record, and there appeared to be a reluctance to pursue leads that pointed toward homicide. Whether this was due to incompetence, pressure from higher up, or a desire to avoid scandal involving a famous figure remains unclear, but the implications are chilling. Instead of a rock star quietly succumbing to his own reckless lifestyle, the story becomes one of a life violently cut short in an act of personal animosity, a crime of passion or frustration, rather than the slow burn of self-destruction. It raises questions about the people Jones surrounded himself with in his last days. Were they friends, opportunists, individuals who saw a vulnerable man cut off from his professional lifeline and felt emboldened to take advantage of him? If the new evidence is correct, the events of that night were not inevitable, not the tragic but predictable conclusion to a life of excess, but a crime that could have been prevented. The details that have now emerged also paint a vivid scene of those final moments. Witnesses describe how Jones and Thorogood were seen together near the pool, voices raised, the mood tense. Some remember Jones trying to distance himself, perhaps wanting to end the conversation. Moments later, there is an account of sudden splashing and shouting, then an eerie silence. When Jones was pulled from the water, attempts at resuscitation were described as half-hearted, with some individuals allegedly reluctant to get too close or too involved. These behaviors, interpreted now in light of the new findings, suggest not shock and panic, but an uneasy awareness that something irreversible had just happened. That this new understanding has come after so many decades is both extraordinary and disturbing. It suggests that those who knew the truth, or at least suspected it, chose silence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of self-preservation. In the intervening years, those silences hardened into accepted facts, shaping the way music history recorded Brian Jones's end. His legacy was framed by the idea of a brilliant but doomed musician who drowned after falling victim to his own lifestyle. The murder theory was relegated to the fringes, a piece of rock folklore that serious historians treated with skepticism. Now, with corroborating statements aligning from multiple independent sources, that folklore seems far closer to fact than fiction. The implications go beyond the personal tragedy of Brian Jones. They speak to the vulnerability of high-profile figures who live in a haze of fame, surrounded by people whose intentions may be far from pure. They reveal how easily a public narrative can be shaped by those in power, whether in the media, the police, or within a celebrity's own circle. The idea that a man could be killed, the truth known by several people, and yet the official version remain unchallenged for decades, is as sobering as it is unsettling. It forces a reconsideration not just of Jones's death, but of other cases where the official story might be more convenient than accurate. There is also the matter of the symbolism that now attaches to Jones's end. At the time, he was the first of the great rock casualties of the late 1960s, a decade defined by both creative revolution and self-destruction. The official account fit neatly into that cultural script, a gifted artist undone by excess. But if the truth is that his life was taken by another's hand, then the meaning of his story changes completely. It becomes a cautionary tale not about overindulgence, but about trust, exploitation, and the dangers lurking in the shadows of celebrity. The weight of these revelations is particularly heavy for those who admired Jones, not only for his role in shaping the Rolling Stones, but for his restless musical curiosity. He was a pioneer in bringing unusual instruments into rock arrangements, sitar, dulcimer, marimba, long before world music became a fashionable term. His departure from the band was not the fading out of a spent creative force. Those close to him insist he was making plans for new projects, exploring fresh directions. This makes the alleged motive of the altercation, a dispute over something as banal as unpaid work, all the more tragic. A man poised to embark on a new artistic chapter was instead silenced forever. In light of the new evidence, the image of Brian Jones last night becomes almost cinematic in its tension. The country house, the heated words by the pool, the stillness of the rural night broken by the sound of water and muffled voices, and then the silence. The guests, unsure whether to intervene or unwilling. The quick construction of an accident narrative before the police arrived. The paperwork that smoothed over inconsistencies, and the years of quiet during which the man at the center of it all was remembered not as a victim of a violent act, but as an architect of his own destruction. The resurfacing of this truth also speaks to the endurance of human memory and conscience. People who kept silent in 1969, or who told partial truths, may have done so out of fear or loyalty. But as decades pass, allegiances shift, fears fade, and the weight of keeping such a secret can become unbearable. It is often at such moments, when the players are older, when the stakes have shifted, that suppressed truths begin to seep out. In this case, the voices speaking now are not doing so for personal gain. If anything, they expose themselves to scrutiny. Their accounts, aligning with long-suspected inconsistencies, breathe new life into a case that many believed was closed forever. For those who have studied Jones's life and death, the pieces now fit in ways they never did before. The persistent rumors about a confrontation, the odd behavior of certain witnesses, the abrupt ending of the investigation, these no longer appear as isolated curiosities, but as interconnected parts of a larger, darker truth. The idea that Brian Jones's death was not the inevitable end of a rock and roll cliché, but the result of a deliberate act forces a re-evaluation of one of music's most enduring myths. It is a reminder that behind the glamour, the fame, and the mythology, there are often very human, very dangerous dynamics at play. The story of that night is no longer just a tale of a rock star who drowned in his pool. It is the story of how power, fear, and personal animosity can collide in a single irreversible moment. It is the story of how truth can be hidden, manipulated, and delayed for decades, but not erased. And it is, ultimately, the story of how one man's life, brimming with musical talent and creative promise, was taken not by the recklessness of his own choices, but by the violence of another. Now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally aligning, the death of Brian Jones stands as a stark warning about the fragility of truth in the face of convenience. It forces a reconsideration of the people who were there that night, the choices they made, and the roles they played in shaping a narrative that endured for over 50 years. It strips away the romantic veneer that once covered this tragedy, revealing something far more unsettling, a calculated act hidden in plain sight, and the silence that allowed it to stand unchallenged for generations. If the revelations are accurate, then the question is no longer what happened to Brian Jones on that July night, but why it took so long for the truth to surface. The answer may lie in a combination of fear, self-interest, and the allure of a simpler story. After all, the myth of the doomed rock star is easier to digest than the messy reality of murder. Yet in peeling back that myth, a deeper, more human truth emerges, one in which loyalty, betrayal, and the corrosive effects of resentment are as central to the story as music ever was. What happened at Cotchford Farm in the early hours of July 3, 1969 is no longer the unsolvable enigma it once seemed. The image of Brian Jones at the bottom of his pool is now framed not as the endpoint of a life spiraling out of control, but as the result of a confrontation that turned deadly. It is a revelation that reshapes not only the history of one man, but also the broader understanding of how easily truth can be lost, and how shocking it can be when it finally emerges into the light. The rediscovery of key facts surrounding Brian Jones's death has prompted a new wave of investigation into the setting, the personalities involved, and the chain of events that led to that fateful moment. To understand the gravity of what has now been revealed, it is necessary to examine Cotchford Farm not just as a backdrop, but as a living environment that reflected the state of Jones's mind during his final days. The house itself, steeped in literary history and rural quiet, might have seemed like a sanctuary from the chaotic glare of the London music scene. Yet, in reality, it became a stage where unresolved tensions, financial disputes, and simmering resentments played out. The idyllic facade of the countryside could not shield Jones from the human conflicts that would ultimately define his last night. Those who knew him in this period describe a man who was physically weakened, but mentally restless. He had been shedding some of his most toxic habits and seemed intent on finding new purpose away from the band he had created. There were reports of him exploring folk and blues projects, inviting musicians to jam at the farm, and planning possible collaborations. But his personal life was not free of complexity. Relationships shifted constantly, and his inner circle often included individuals whose motives were questionable. In this atmosphere, the arrival of people like Frank Thorogood was significant. Thorogood was more than a laborer. He had become intertwined in Jones' daily existence, eating meals with him, lingering after work hours, and participating in late-night gatherings. This closeness, however, did not mean trust. Their bond was punctuated by financial disagreements, mutual suspicion, and flashes of hostility. What makes the recent revelations so striking is the way they alter the perceived timeline of that evening. In the old version of the story, the hours before Jones entered the pool were a blur of drinking, casual conversation, and perhaps some light-hearted swimming. Now, with corroborating accounts surfacing, the picture looks far darker. There were episodes of raised voices that carried across the property, moments when guests were drawn to the edge of the pool area not for leisure, but because they sensed trouble brewing. People have described an atmosphere that shifted from mildly tense to palpably dangerous in the space of minutes. Jones, it seems, may have been trying to de-escalate, to withdraw from the situation, while Thorogood pressed the confrontation further. This reframing of the night introduces a level of intentionality to the events that cannot be ignored. It is one thing for an intoxicated individual to stumble into a dangerous situation of their own making. It is another for a person to be physically overpowered and submerged. The chilling possibility is that Jones's final moments were not marked by confusion or inebriation, but by the very real awareness that he was in danger. If he struggled, even briefly, then his death becomes something far more harrowing than an accident. It becomes a violent encounter in which his physical fragility, weakened by past substance use and recent illness, made him no match for his assailant. In the decades since his passing, many of those who were present that night have either died or remained silent. But silence does not erase the impressions and memories that those people carried. In some cases, these memories have only grown sharper over time, as guilt or reflection forced individuals to reconsider what they saw. A few of the accounts now emerging are remarkable not only for their detail but for their candor. They describe hurried conversations immediately after Jones's body was discovered, in which certain individuals insisted on sticking to a version of events that omitted any hint of a struggle. They recall how, when police arrived, these agreed-upon details were repeated with uncanny consistency, as though rehearsed. It is not difficult to see how such a version could become the official one, especially in an era when celebrity deaths were often handled with a mix of discretion and expedience. In 1969, the cultural landscape was saturated with headlines about the excesses of rock stars, their brushes with the law, and their flirtations with danger. It would not have been surprising for the police, the press, or even the public to accept that Jones had drowned because he had been careless. That narrative was neat, tragic, and entirely believable within the stereotypes of the time. It was also far less messy than acknowledging a homicide involving people in Jones's inner circle. The recent breakthrough in the case owes much to the persistence of those who refused to accept the tidy conclusion offered all those years ago. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and even retired officers have sifted through forgotten reports, re-interviewed witnesses, and pieced together scraps of overlooked evidence. Their work has revealed inconsistencies in the initial statements, missing pages from police logs, and forensic details that were never fully examined. Even the physical state of Jones's body, as described by those who saw it that night, contains elements that raise questions, such as marks that could be consistent with restraint or force, details that were quietly set aside rather than pursued. From a broader perspective, this development also forces a reconsideration of the role that power dynamics play in both life and death. Brian Jones, despite his fame, was in a diminished position by the summer of 1969. He had been removed from the band he created. His financial stability was uncertain, and his influence over those around him had waned. In such a state, he was vulnerable to exploitation, not just financially but physically. Those who harbored resentment toward him, or who saw him as an obstacle or a source of debt, may have felt emboldened to act in ways they never would have dared when he was at the height of his fame and authority. The implications stretch beyond the individual case. If someone as visible as Brian Jones could be killed and the act concealed beneath a veneer of accident for over 50 years, then it raises uncomfortable questions about how many other high-profile deaths might hide similar truths. Fame may bring visibility, but it also attracts opportunists, and the machinery of public relations can be as effective at obscuring the truth as it is at broadcasting it. Examining the psychology of those present that night is equally compelling. In any group witnessing an act of violence or its immediate aftermath, there is a moment when individuals must decide whether to speak up or to stay quiet. Fear of retaliation, desire to avoid scandal, or even misplaced loyalty can silence witnesses. In Jones's case, those factors seem to have converged perfectly, creating a wall of silence that persisted long enough for the official narrative to calcify. Over time, even those who may have doubted the accident story likely found it easier to live with that version than to reopen old wounds or face legal scrutiny. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Brian Jones's death mystery being finally solved after decades? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.